Thank you, Gerard, and also I'd like to thank His Excellency the Ambassador of the Fondazione SUM and Janie and the Scientific Committee of the conference for the kind invitation to talk on a topic that, well, a bit like Bob really, been fascinated with for many, many, many years. So, arms and armour in museums, which is really more what I will talk about today, represents a certain sort of taxonomic classification for museums that museums have had some difficulty in framing. And I think we can get a sense of that if we consider them in relation to taxonomic studies of what constitutes a collection in a museum, particularly that by Susan Pearce in her classic On Collecting, an Investigation into Collecting in the European Tradition, where she essentially tries to differentiate the collection that we're used to in museums and other assemblages of objects that she says would not fall into the category of a collection that we would expect to find in a museum or a private collection. And for her, the defining feature of a collection of the type that we see in a museum is value. If the objects are valued for their intrinsic use, then they're not a collection. But if they are valued for their abstract value, their symbolic value, if you like, then they are a collection. Of course, a collection of art is the ultimate expression of that idea. Now, obviously, armour, in some senses, falls between those two polarities of definition. They are both aesthetic, as we've been seeing this morning, and highly functional. In this sense, the presentation of armour in museums, in some senses, often falls between two stools, two sides of the polarity, which I'm really going to be suggesting in this paper. Earlier traditions of display and collecting were more multivalent in their understanding of how to present this material. Well, I guess we're more used to seeing them in this sort of context, in an art museum type presentation, which would present them very much as isolated, autonomous objects of luxury decorative art, which of course, in one sense, they were. And as we've heard this morning, they were extraordinarily accomplished, advanced works of art. They were extremely expensive, particularly the ceremonial. It's very important, I think, to make the distinction between ceremonial arms and armour and arms and armour produced for war, as it were. And these works that we're seeing really today mostly are very much ceremonial pieces for processions, reviews, festivals, tournaments, etc. So we would say recreational and ceremonial use. Very elaborate, very expensive. This is a detail from Philip II's armour of Spain that I'll be showing later in the full view, and it cost 3,000 escudos, gold escudos, which is 12 times as expensive as the money that Charles V and Philip spent for major works of art by Titian. So it's 12 times as expensive as the most expensive painting of the day. So these really are absolutely luxury expressions of taste and power. They are, if you like, the Lamborghini of their day. And also, I think it's very important to note that they're highly spectatorial in the way that they were experienced in these ceremonial, elaborately attenuated ritual of the tournament, which was, a major spectator sport, as you see from contemporary illustrations showing the tournament. And then also there were moments when they were literally represented as an exhibition format. This is an amazing tournament book by René of Anjou in the 15th century, and it shows the moment before the tournament when the burgonets with the visors and the bevoirs of the knights and their amazingly elaborate crests that you see there that identified each of the knights were actually displayed for a period before the tournament and then inspected by the lords and ladies. And any knights who were judged to have acted in an unknightly fashion, their helmets were taken off the list. So amazing kind of courtly kind of power play going on via this exhibition of armour prior to a tournament, as Bob certainly has been emphasising. They were, though, of course, technologies of warfare. They were creations for enacting lethal force, and functionally, therefore, they were extremely significant. Your very life depended on them, obviously, in battle, but also, even also in the ceremonial and tournament environment. They were also, of course, like a kind of a shark kind of beneath the water. There was also the danger of lethal force. And of course, the great example of that, the tragic example of that, the notorious example of that was the death of Henry II in 1559, when his opponent supposedly, according to the story, didn't let go of the lance quick enough once it shattered. The lances were made to shatter on impact, and for some reason he still held onto the lance a little too long, and a piece of the lance went into Henry's visor and killed him. So that, I guess, presentation of armour more contextually in terms of its functionality is more the kind of presentation that we'd be more, I guess, used to seeing in museums that present armour more from their social, cultural, historical perspective, and there are many such museums. Tower of London, the Royal Armoury, wonderful museum on the right there. I haven't actually been to it, but I would love to go, is the Higgins Armoury Museum in Worcester, Massachusetts, an amazing collection of armour there, and they often have these kinds of recreation educational programs where they become animated by, showing this is an example of how to fight like a Viking, apparently, on the right. So we feel like they're the two polarities. On the one hand, a very isolating, context-less art museum type presentation focusing on the aesthetic qualities of armour. On the other hand, a very sort of functional, utilitarian, this is how we kill people using armour, that we would often find more in a social history type museum. The two poles there. But really my argument today is that original collections and displays of arms and armour was much more multivalent and understanding of the way that they moved around and among these two polarities. First, I think we need to make a distinction between different types of collection of arms and armour in the Renaissance and the Baroque. And I suppose the most utilitarian is this one here, is the garrison/arsenal collection, which would be a kind of a stockpiling of arms and armour to be used in the event of war, collected by the prince. This particular amazing museum, the Landeszeughaus in Graz, was a collection put together in the 17th century as a bulwark against the Turks by the state of Styria in Eastern Europe. The idea of sort of keeping this that could be mobilised in the event of war against the Turks. So this is, I guess, the most functional, sort of less sort of theatrical type of collection, but I would argue even here there is a sense of this, what I'm really going to focus on is the emphasis on trying to animate the armour. We still get that sense with the idea of kind of a guard of honour that protects the collection. But certainly that is much more evident in the more public ceremonial display collections created for the prince, ruling dynasties, that was really absolutely a basic requirement of any major courtly dynastic household of the day. And we see here the Palazzo Reale in Turin, the armoury of the House of Savoy, beautiful, amazing early 19th century display, which nonetheless very much continues Renaissance and Baroque patterns of display that I'll be talking about today. Now, the meanings and messages of collections of this kind are seen, I guess, particularly clearly in the extraordinarily still maintained collection of the Archduke Ferdinand II at Schloss Ambras near Innsbruck. Now, scholars of the early history museums will know that Ferdinand II is one of the most sort of famous collectors of the Northern European Renaissance, particularly for his Kunst- und Wunderkammer collection, which is one of the best preserved and therefore most studied collections of its type. But less well known, but for him certainly equally important, was his armour collection. And he in fact had 4 rooms, large rooms, as you see here, for his armour collection, and they were classified into different sections. So he had a Rustkammer, which is a general armour chamber, a Lieb-Rustkammer, which is a personal armour chamber, and a Helden-Rustkammer, a hero's armour chamber that I'll be showing in a second. So the general collection, amazing materials, very much illustrative of his wider interest in the Kunst und der Wunderkammer, the idea of Meraviglia, the idea of marvels, wonders, objects and events that somehow burst through the boundaries of kind of normality, as it were, of the world. And the idea was that you would study them as a means of trying to understand the mind of God. And wonderful documentation there of this poor Hungarian noble, Grigor Bácsi, who supposedly had a lance right through his head and lived to tell the tale, supposedly. Also, armour, owned by dwarves, armour owned by giants, exotica, Asiatic armour from Japan, just illustrated there by this detail of a 17th century Flemish painting with a somewhat inaccurately represented samurai suit amidst kind of ethnographic anthropological collection, so very much what he was doing as well. But he also had his Lieb-Rustkammer, which is his personal armour chamber, which was his own collection of armour. So the idea there of obviously projecting himself as a great seigneurial lord, remembering that he was the brother of the Holy Roman Emperor, the great-grandson of Maximilian I, who was, the greatest sort of patron of armour at Nuremberg and patron of Dürer, etc., and the nephew of Charles V. So he's very much inserting himself into that tradition. Possibly the most interesting thing, though, was his Helden-Rustkammer, the hero's armour chamber. And this was a major cultural diplomatic initiative that he put together, basically asking for donations of major suits of armour from all of the key leading aristocratic families of the day, as a means of creating a kind of a gallery of heroic portraiture in armour. Quite an amazing thing, and sort of reinforced by then frescoes also. These were really very fascinating. So the idea was to create a kind of gallery of effigies of great leaders, and then he accompanied that with a catalogue, supposedly the first ever printed catalogue of a museum collection of 1603, the Armamentarium Heroicum, which would have a representation of the figure wearing the suit of armour and then pointing to a narrative on the other page as a double-page spread of the significant achievements, military and otherwise, of that person. So really what I'm arguing here, or what I think is really obvious about them, is the idea that it's a means of reanimating the body within the armour so that the armour acts as a kind of bringing the personage alive, almost as it were, in the room in front of you in relation to all of the other very significant suits of armour. So, for example, Cosimo had an armour of his donated to the Duke Cosimo of Medici. De Medici had an armour donated to him by his son, Ferdinando, which would have been very similar in a way, this sort of presentation of Cosimo standing there, as it were, in the armoury, to the grandiloquent military statues commissioned of Cosimo by Giambologna, Francavilla and the like. A symbolic portrait gallery just rather similar to what we heard this morning. Really all major armories of Europe had that as a significant aspect to their communication agenda. Here we see on the left the Grand Ducal Palace in, or rather the Palazzo Ducale in Venice, and there's a donated armour belonging to Henry IV, which is kind of therefore a projection of his identity, his personage, as it were, as an ally of the Venetian Republic there in the armoury. And we've already been seeing a lot of this armour, the fantastic armour of Charles V and his son Philip II of Spain, the Habsburg collection, the most significant collection of armour in Europe. These armours were meant to be kind of, as I say, projections of the identity, the personage of these rulers in this kind of deluxe, elaborate presentation of their the animated bodies within the suits of armour. They were understood to be projections of these rulers, and that's even more emphasised here in a mannequin which actually reproduces the features of Philip II, so that he's literally kind of inhabiting his own suit of armour. Another very, very important meaning in these early collections, which has already been alluded to, but which was very fundamental, is the idea of loot, trophy, and booty. I did a Google search for booty collections, and it was not really what I was after. But anyway, yes. Crossed over into a realm that was a bit further than what I was after. Anyway, trophies, very important, and of course the Greco-Roman tradition of trophies being collected and then brought to public spaces as a sort of a triumphal projection of the dominance of the general over the defeated armies is extremely important since time immemorial, and very important in ceremonial triumphal entries, etc., during the Renaissance and the Baroque. And we see the Maximilian fantastic Dürer documentation of the Maximilian's procession with this fantastic carriage. You see, obviously, all those suits of armour are much larger than life-size. They're these sort of huge kind of festival creations. And Rubens doing the same thing in the 17th century with contemporary armour and subjugated peoples, the people that you have defeated at the bottom there. Now, in Europe, this meant generally Turkish spoils of war. The Dresden armoury has a whole room, the Persian room, a whole room full of armour taken mostly from the battlefield. But one of the most interesting examples still extant, I think, of this kind of projection of the idea of armour as a sign of victory against one's enemies is back in the Palazzo Reale in Turin, in this amazing armoury I showed you before. There's an amazing sort of symbolic meeting of the House of Savoy, the great general Prince Eugene of Savoy, who was late 17th, early 18th century military leader who won various campaigns against the Turks and the French. He's there opposed by the Turks as a kind of opposing forces. And what's interesting about this is the idea of trophy collections has passed from literal trophies to symbolic. The point is not really whether they really were collected on the battlefield, but really more the effect that they create, because we actually know these suits of armour were actually bought in the 19th century, so they're not original things that were captured on the battlefield, but they serve the effect of conveying that impression. Now, one of the most, for me, most amazing, most powerful expressions of this kind of idea of a trophy collection and this idea of animated figures sort of speaking across an exhibition platform would originally have been found in the Uffizi in Florence, in the armoury that was put together originally by Ferdinando, who I mentioned before, and then augmented further by other Medici members. And I think it really, we sort of forget the importance of armour in collections of this type, because ultimately these collections were moved out of the Uffizi, and the Uffizi became just, as it were, an art gallery. But early on it certainly was much more than that. And in fact, the Medici armoury took up 5 rooms of the Uffizi right next to the Tribuna, which is kind of the centrepiece to the Uffizi. So showing the incredible importance that they gave to this collection. Now, we don't have, I mean, it's been dispersed, but we have to reconstruct it from early inventories. There's an inventory of 1631 that mentions or describes the entrance, the first room to this collection. When you entered, would have been here, you were greeted with this incredible tableau vivant of two full-length suits of armour facing each other on horseback. One, a Christian knight on horseback, dressed for the tournament with a lance and a pennant, and on the other, a Turk with a turban and also a pennant and a scimitar, and in the other arm a shield. And the shield was in fact none other than Caravaggio's severed head of the Medusa, painted to be presented to the Medici family as a diplomatic gift by Caravaggio's great early patron, Cardinal Francesco del Monte. Now, as we know, the wonderful shield of Caravaggio, this ceremonial shield that, fortunately, I suppose, from our point of view, was never actually used in battle, was based on a famous prototype of Leonardo, a painting that was now lost, but that he would have known about from Vasari and other early sources. But what's perhaps not so much stressed and should be stressed more is that it's equally influenced by contemporary armour design, such as we've already been mentioning, and such as this wonderful parade shield for Charles V, made by the Negroli that we've been mentioning already, the great Milanese armourers of the mid-16th century. And also, as Bob has already mentioned, the idea of this sort of juxtaposition was almost apotropaic in the sense of just as Perseus, killing the Medusa and then carrying aloft the head of the Medusa, was able to strike fear and terror into the heart of his enemies to such a degree that they turned to stone, as you see here in the wonderful painting by Giordano and configured also by the wonderful statue by Cellini, of course, so too this shield sort of symbolically performs the same function. And you are the enemy, as it were, who walks into this room and is sort of symbolically turned to stone as you see this incredible sight. It would have been quite an amazingly powerful exhibition. Of course, it's witty. It's not literal. It's a kind of a pleasurable terror that you would have experienced coming into this room. So, turning now, last little section of the talk now to more modern contemporary attempts to convey a bit more of that sort of context that surrounds armour. There are various ways of doing it. One is the idea of the diorama, where the armour literally becomes animated because it sort of is part of a sort of a tableau with the figures actually in action. This is a diorama of the Battle of Pavia of 1525 in the Royal Armoury at Leeds. I think it's very effective and very powerful, but I recognise that probably that level of animation, for an art museum would probably be considered to be going a little too far. So then I guess the challenge is, how does one convey the sense of the animation and the kind of projective theatricality that we've been talking about in these collections a little more subtly? This is very interesting, actually. This is an exhibition from 1998 that came to Australia of armour from, in fact, the Landeshaus Museum in Graz that I mentioned before. And you see they've sort of come to life, as it were, in this wonderful design by Gregory Burgess architects. This toured to the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney and, in fact, the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne. Some of you might even remember it. Again, possibly I think the point here is that you can animate these armours to a degree because they really work as an ensemble. They're not individually so significant that you need to focus on them as individual pieces, so that maybe one can kind of give this quite theatrical appearance to them there. Possibly, for my money, slightly more successfully is the Kunsthistorisches armour collection in Vienna, which, along with Madrid, the two great European repositories of arms and armour still extant. And what they've done slightly more subtly is they've created the impression of a kind of a foot tournament, a melee or something of that kind, by creating almost an arena type effect that you walk around. And it makes you very aware of the suits of armour as kind of bodies in space, dynamically interrelated one to each other. And of course, you also, as you walk around it, and it's a very powerful experience. So in some senses, it's very much in the tradition that I've been talking about, but quite subtly underplayed in the way that they present the material. And I think it's important to remember also that some of these suits of armour, for their type, are among the most significant suits still extant, like the Maximilian suit at the top there, you know, one of the most important representations of that type still extant in the world. And this armour here, the Tonlet foot tournament armour of the Grand Duke of Burgundy, you know, you don't perhaps realise it if you're not, I guess, totally au fait with armour collections, but they're, you know, absolutely uniquely significant suits of armour. So you do get a chance to appreciate them on an individual level, autonomously presented almost as works of art, but at the same time they have this sort of interactive quality, which I think is very, very successfully done. And perhaps most impressive of all, the entrance to this collection has these tournament jousting knights almost about to sort of collide in a way which is sort of educational in that it reconstructs the amazing caparison for the horses and also the amazing crests that these are German mid-16th century armour would have. But at the same time, obviously, it's incredibly projective, it's very dramatic, it's very sort of dynamic in the way the figures become interrelated to themselves and to you in space as you walk around them. But finally, really as homage, I think, to the great innovativeness of the Museo Pol di Pezzoli that we have been invoking several times in today and yesterday's proceedings, I want to cite the example of the Museo Pol di Pezzoli and the recent redesign of the Armoury collection that they did, which I think is extremely successful for the traditions that we've been talking about. As in fact has already been mentioned, the whole kind of core really of the collections of the Pol di Pezzoli was the armour collection that Gian Giacomo Pol di Pezzoli put together in the 1840s onwards, and then presented in this incredible neo-Gothic projective environment. Of course, though, tragically, this room was destroyed during Allied bombing of the Second World War at Milan, and so the need was there to reconstruct this collection and its ambience in a modern setting. Now, early examples, I think, very classically sort of show a sort of, in terms of the things we've been talking about today, a sort of lack of certainty, really, a lack of clarity about quite how to present the material. On the one hand, there's a sense of trying to present it in a way that is somehow in keeping with these collections that I was speaking about before, particularly the sort of massed ensemble presentation, the quasi-trophy type presentation. But overall, there's a sort of aridity, there's a modern kind of antiseptic purity to the way the pieces are created, which I feel is somewhat, you know, a bit indicative of that period of museological presentation, really. But it's neither one thing nor the other. It doesn't really work. So ultimately what they did in the late 1990s, early 2000s was commission the artist Arnaldo Pomodoro to create a new environment for the works and then to reposition them so that they were almost like a kind of an installation piece that the artist Pomodoro had created. Which for me was an inspired and in some ways quite a brave, museological initiative because the collections are themselves extremely important, so there's a sense of you need to have a respect to those works of art individually, but at the same time you need to reconfigure them for a modern audience. And I think Pomodoro has done that very, very brilliantly here, and I think a lot of that is to do with his status not only as a very significant artist, and in fact the National Gallery of Victoria bought a major work by Pomodoro in the 70s, which should still be on display, I think, but anyway, he's quite an important artist, internationally, very much so, but also a major set designer. He actually did a lot of set designs for the Scala, La Scala, and indeed there's a book just been published on his set designs for La Scala. So he combines both high artistic credibility and innovation as an artist with a kind of theatrical background, I think, that created a very, very, very powerful display. You see here in my somewhat inadequate photos, and here this sense of the animation, the sense of the projectiveness of these bodies that are about to come alive, and clank into life, as it were, in our space. They've been described rather, I think, in a quite a sort of suggestive, evocative way by Annalisa Zani, who it's delighted to say is here with us today. She says, as part of her overview of her directorship of this project, she says, if I can translate somewhat inadequately, these objects for a time in the past were bringers of death, and they're often presented in museum exhibitions in a manner which is disordered and dusty, almost quasi-cimiteriali, almost like cemeteries. And in this way, they have in the past, in this sort of presentation, transmitted impressions of distance and abandonment. But today, instead, they are brought back to life in vitrines, exalted in their true quality. You see these vitrines with the works in relation one to the other, illuminated by una luce chiara che assume un valore simbolico e metafisico. Beautiful description, I think, of the way in which they have, I think, got the balance very beautifully right in terms of reanimating these collections in a way that's very much in keeping with the earlier presentation of them in the 19th century. Also points the way forward to the future with sort of contemporary installation art, but at the same time also very much is totally in sync with the traditions of Baroque and Renaissance presentation of reanimating the body through the armour that I've been talking about today. Thank you very much.